This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. The COP29 climate conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, has concluded without a clear agreement on the new Quantified Collective Goal or NCQG on climate finance commitments. Now, this NCQG refers to the money that would be or would have been given by the developed countries to developing countries to meet their climate transition goals. But instead of an NCQG deal, what has really emerged from this COP29 is that the rich countries have agreed to pledge $300 billion annually as a base figure to lead further efforts to raise $1.3 trillion annually from 2035. But developing countries have called this non-deal deal as an insult, as it seems to shift the onus of raising the rest of the money on to developing countries. But as per the Paris Agreement, a target higher than $100 billion per annum had to be agreed upon by 2025, and it's not really happened. Apart from this, there was also an agreement reached on global standards for carbon markets and trading, and the COP29 presidency also launched the Reducing Methane from Organic Waste declaration, which saw over 30 countries declaring their commitment to sectoral targets to reducing methane produced from organic waste. So these are the three broad outcomes that everybody has been talking about from COP29. How do we assess this year's conference in terms of moving the needle forward, particularly on climate finance? How do we understand the outcomes with regard to carbon markets and the drawdown on fossil fuel consumption? What about the old issue of loss and damage funds? Where do we stand on this front? So we discuss the COP29 in pretty much close detail in this episode of In Focus. And we have with us Nagraj Adwe, a founder member of Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, or TACC, who has been speaking and writing on the science and politics of global warming for the last 18 years. Nagraj, welcome to In Focus. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me, Sampath.
So, Nagraj, to start with, the big question on climate finance, this everybody has been talking about this new collective quantified goal, NCQG, which should have been agreed upon in this year's conference. But instead, we have a $300 billion per annum commitment from 2035, as opposed to the expectation of about $1 trillion. And the developing countries have been encouraged, quote unquote, to sort of mobilize the rest of the funds through voluntary means if possible. So what are your thoughts on this figure of 300 billion, and how justified are developing countries, including India, which has explicitly rejected this offer?
Well, Sampath, to call it disappointing would be an understatement. And basically, it's a grave abdication of responsibility by the rich developed countries towards many of the world's poor. And like you said, actually, the demand was actually for $1.33 trillion. So this amount is basically meant to cover mitigation, which is, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, which is sort of preparing infrastructure, etc., in advance before impacts hit. Now, do we have robust estimates of the kind of amounts needed? We do. For example, last year, China spent $790 billion, almost $800 billion on renewables and non-fossil fuels, and yet only addressed their emissions incrementally. So we're talking of the amount of cutting emissions. I mean, if you keep aside, let's say, the US, EU, and China in the rest of the developing world, which is basically what this amount is trying to target as far as mitigation goes. In the rest of the world, the total emissions is in the range of 18 billion tons of CO2 each year. That's a scale what you're talking about. And as far as adaptation goes, the UN's Adaptation Gap Report of 2024, which was released earlier this month, suggests that a sum of $387 billion a year is needed for adaptation alone by 2030. So we're talking of very large amounts. And it's not as if they don't have the money. I mean, the US military spending last year was $916 billion. And renowned economists like Jyoti Ghosh and others have suggested many ways in which one could raise funds, by which developed countries could raise funds. You could talk of a wealth tax, which applies to the rich everywhere. You could sort of have windfall profits on fossil fuel companies because of the super profits they've been making these last few years. You could have a financial transaction tax. So there are measures that are possible given a political will. The other part of this, I think, is that 2035 is just way too far. There should have been a stronger target for 2030 and then have an even larger target on the amounts we're talking about 1.3 trillion, etc., by 2035. Now, there are at least three implications of this very modest figure that's been put forward. One is that a lot of the poor countries will either have to continue to be energy deficient, continue to consume fossil fuels, or both. Two, they'll have to borrow at higher interest rates, which actually connects to a major demand being made at COP29 by the developing countries and others, which is that a large share needs to be either as grants or at least as concessional loans. And the reason for that is that interest rates for concessional loans tend to be quite low in the range of, they can range from 0.5 to 1 to 2%. Whereas commercial loans typically are in the range of 8 to 10% or even more, which will
So
essentially.
these loans you're talking about, are they loans for financing your fuel requirements, or are they loans for financing your climate mitigation measures or for climate adaptation? What are these loans you're talking about referring to?
Yeah, so these loans are primarily that could be taken from essentially from private parties, from private banks, from even private mutual fund institutions like BlackRock, etc., which is one of the largest sort of holder of these kind of funds. And these loans are very often given at rates that are much higher than concessional loans or indeed grants, which are
No, no, for what purpose?
that's right. So they would be taken for a range of measures that could do with either it could do with a installation of infrastructure for adaptation. Say if you want to build stormwater drains, or if you want to build a more robust housing for the poor, etc. Or it could be for the expansion of renewables, of solar and wind projects, etc. So essentially the point is either whether it is for expanding renewables or it's for instituting infrastructure in place which will cushion the impacts of climate change. If you don't have grants, if you don't have public funds from developed countries, as is the case right now following COP, then the only other option that they have is to go for loans that are commercial. And that's a danger because what it does is it puts them even further in debt. In fact, Jyoti has made the point that last year there were 70 countries in need of debt relief. So if you have sort of commercial loans, then it sort of pushes them further in debt. And the point also is essentially means that they will also lack the infrastructure to protect themselves against sort of accelerating impacts. And our impacts are sort of unavoidably accelerating because the planet has been warming at a faster rate since about 2010. It's been warming at about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So by 2035, which is what this amount talks about, the planet will reach about 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And as for them rejecting the offer, the sad part is they can't reject it. It's something that's thrust upon them because the LDCs, the less developed countries, have very few options to go. And where would you go, in terms of being able to generate the funds? They have to there's no question of rejecting it. I mean, they have to sort of live with it and push it sort of going forward in the years going forward at COPs.
Right. While on the subject of climate finance, Nagaraj, a related issue is this loss and damage fund. I mean, it was a big theme last year and the year before that, but we didn't hear much about this particular, discourse this year. Like, where do we stand on this?
That's right. That's right. So, there's been no exactly what is a loss and damage fund. So actually, in a sense, climate finance deals with sort of three broad areas. There's the two areas we just talked about, which is mitigation and adaptation. And the third area is loss and damage, which has to do with helping people after a climate impact hits. That's people who sort of lose their homes or livelihoods or lands by flooding, etc. It also has a non-economic component, but we can keep that aside. But at the COP29 in Baku, to address your question, effectively there was no progress in the loss and damage fund. I mean, there are a few minor operative agreements that were signed between the fund's board and the World Bank, such as the Secretariat hosting agreement, who will host the board, etc. And then there was merely a signing of documents to enable that the fund start distributing money from next year. Now, it was operationalized last year, and so far, before Baku, the funds receive a merely 700 million. There were a couple of additional pledges in Baku, but nothing to write home about. So as of 4 days ago, the total of 731 million, I'm quoting official sources here, was pledged from 26 donors, of which the United States has given, just 17 million. I mean, it's pathetic. They probably spent more money on renovating the White House. Now you just contrast these kind of small amounts with, say, the Pakistan floods in 2022, which affected 33 million people, where 2 million homes were destroyed. It cost them billions of dollars. We're talking about a fund that's just merely around 700 million. Again, these are extreme events that will accelerate. Now, at COP, some developing countries and civil society organizations were pushing for the loss and damage fund to be included within the earlier goal that we were talking about in the NCQG. So perhaps as a sub goal within an overall target. So perhaps so that loss and damage could have more assured and larger funding. But this demand was completely sidestepped. Again, what are its implications for ordinary people? I mean, essentially, they've been thrown under the bus. They left their own devices or insufficient funds to cope after a climate event hits.
Right. I mean, clearly a lack of interest or will, I don't know what to put it, on the part of the Western countries. Now, the second big event or an outcome or a development in COP29 was the rules, some kind of a deal on rules for global trading on carbon credits. So, what exactly does this deal say? I mean, there have been concerns about how you do the accounting. Can you one country is supposed to have sold it to another country? How do you make sure that both the countries don't use the same credits twice or something like that? Those kinds of issues have been raised. So, what does this new deal on global standards do, and how effective do you think it would be in sort of helping the planet reach its climate goals?
Yeah, so more broadly, this issue of carbon credits has to do essentially with the commodification of carbon dioxide, which goes back to the Kyoto Protocol 30 years ago. Essentially, what happens is that waste, which in this case is carbon dioxide, becomes a commodity which then companies or countries can trade and therefore profit from. So what this conference did was it pushed through the approvals of certain rules. It was sort of more procedural thing pertaining to methodologies and the removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is what you were just referring to, and its problems. Now, these rules are kind of governed under Article 6.2 or Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, which so the rules are now more or less complete after COP29, after Baku, where essentially the credits can be bought and sold, right? And as far as 6.2 is concerned, it pertains to transparency. But what we essentially have is a market that will work it's yet to begin functioning. They have to yet do certain specific procedural things like approving methodologies or receive registrations from projects under these programs and rules in order to implement them. But they will start functioning in about a couple of years. Now, your question about double counting and how effective they will be is completely valid, and it's a very serious concern. And there are sort of other grave concerns as well. And as far as being effective is concerned, there are at least sort of three issues. One is what you just referred to, which is the possibility of the counting of emission reduction, counting in both the buyer's country and the seller's country, and therefore a double counting. Secondly, there was a study which last year had examined 50 of the largest projects worldwide, such projects under the voluntary carbon market, and broadly found most of them to be junk. They use the word junk, which is to say what they were saying is that they were neither permanent nor additional, which I'll kind of explain. And you see, the thing is that the third concern is that if you are putting away carbon, there are many ways of drawing down carbon. One of the most prominent ways is to do it, by afforestation, deforestation in soils, etc. You kind of draw it down in these land-based systems now and natural-based systems. Now, the thing is that you have to ensure that they stay there for a while. So, a recent paper in Nature has said that you need to lock it away in these forests and so on for at least 1,000 years for this process to be considered reliable. And the same thing applies in a sense in soil. So you've got a problem not just of double counting, you also have a problem of robustness, you have a problem of ensuring that it's sort of additional emissions going down. With the same problem with soil is probably one of the better methods that one can try, because you could try to reduce fertilizer, you could try to do mulching, you could try to have cover crops in ways that augment soil carbon. With soil carbon, a concern is that estimating the baseline is not easy. There are other ways that people have talked about. India, in fact, almost 15 or 17 years ago, was trying a project about fertilizing the oceans, where you sprinkle very tiny iron particles in the oceans, which augments the drawing down of carbon dioxide by the oceans. But a lot of scientists worldwide have suggested caution before trying these methods. But the biggest danger, Sampath, I must point out, and which is why this has been severely condemned, and also the haste, but also the issue itself has been severely condemned by groups both in India and in many other countries in Latin America and Africa, etc. Groups that speak for indigenous communities in these countries, is the danger that such sort of market mechanisms may have, or the implications or the loss of community control over forests and resources for indigenous communities. In a sense, this is another sort of chapter in the long struggle between the state, private capital, and forest communities over the forests and other common resources. And Article 7 may and should not be another weapon, against the indigenous people and forest communities in this long struggle.
Right. So I mean, just to try and unpack what you mean by loss of community rights. So to take an example, let's say there is a developing country which has got a massive forest cover where there are tribal communities living, and there is a developed country which needs to fulfill its carbon reduction commitments. So you could have a situation where this excess of whatever carbon, green cover which this country has, it could sort of give it up to this country or something like that, where the forests get destroyed or something like that. Is that how it works?
Well, essentially, you're trying to do it in two ways. One is that you try to enable control by private capital or the state on forests and other cover, which would then be, that area would then be treated as a commodity, because the kind of the carbon that you're taking down, or additional carbon you're taking down in those areas, essentially can then be traded. That's one way. The other way is that if you try to, as India is trying, which is trying to sort of build plantations somewhere and then pass them off, or even a monocultural kind of forests and then pass them off as for carbon credits, which itself has a danger of, where on the one hand you kind of are cutting down extremely old forests and then sort of having these plantations or other kind of monocultural kind of cropping or growing that's kind of taking place in other regions, which implies essentially a destruction of very old forest cover. So in both ways, it's something that has implications for a number of both Adivasi and other communities who are dependent on forests for their livelihood.
So would you say that with this entire carbon credits trading system or platform taking center stage as one of the mechanisms for climate mitigation, would you say that the danger is that you would end up flattening all distinction between, say, the qualitative distinctions between a forest which is, say, 20,000 or a millennia old forest and a plantation, both become equivalent entities which are commodified for trade? Is that the danger here?
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly the danger that people who are campaigning and concerned about the projects that are planned in Nicobar are talking about, because essentially they are talking about the destruction of a very large, I mean, we're talking of tens of thousands of acres of land there, which would then be kind of compensated by growing sort of, having some plantation. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's somewhere in Haryana. I mean, that's it's just absurd.
So this on the face of it, to everybody's common sense, this is ridiculous and absurd. But within the framework of carbon trading, it makes sense, right?
I mean, it does. By what I mean is that it's an entire mechanism where it's some there are certain areas which are potentially far more dangerous, and therefore the cops going forward need to be particularly careful to prevent this kind of alienation of communities from their land. They need to prevent things like double counting that you are referring to. Then there are other potential mechanisms that issues that may be less hazardous, like the improvement in soil cover and mulching and so on that I was referring to as far as soil cover. But everything needs to be done really carefully to ensure that a process seeking to ostensibly address climate change doesn't become something that is a net negative for ordinary people and indigenous communities.
Right. I mean, net negative, I think that's an important way of looking at it. Now, moving on to the third big aspect of this COP29, Nagaraj, what are your thoughts on this methane declaration? I mean, it's been signed by, I mean, apparently some of the biggest methane emitting countries. 30 of them are the initial signatories, and more are expected to follow. So, how big is this in terms of, is it just like another paper declaration with the rest of it all left to voluntary interest, or is there's a binding commitments here?
Actually, this particular declaration, this reducing methane from organic waste declaration, is actually one of the few positive aspects of the COP29 in Baku. About 20% of the world's anthropogenic methane comes from landfills. And the reason why I'm saying it's one of the few positive aspects, and this is actually based on a conversation that I had with somebody who works with, is part of an NGO that works with the waste workers and so on. Because of its potential benefits that this declaration may have both for waste workers and people who live in the vicinity of landfills. I mean, where I live in North Delhi, further on, there's this massive landfill just further on in North Delhi. Now, so what this person told me, in fact, she referred to it as very, very positive. I'm quoting her because the main reason these landfills burn is that the methane in the landfills when the food decomposes essentially burns, and that releases dioxins and other toxins and so on, which then contaminates both the air and food because it can also travel very far. And I've actually been at meetings where waste workers have been present, and they've talked about how difficult it is to breathe when these landfills sort of burn, etc. And incidentally, it happens happening every summer. It's getting worse as warming kind of intensifies. So actually, a reduction of methane from landfills has the potential, in a sense, of reducing the air and food pollution that's impacting ordinary people and waste workers who live in the vicinity of these landfills. It also has a positive potential, which is it allows, if the way that you can kind of address this is by addressing less food and waste, converting it, doing things like composting, etc., which implies that it's good not just for soil health, but also has a potential of employment generation for ordinary people. More broadly, this pledge, this declaration is part of a pledge to kind of cut methane by about 30% by 2030. That was a pledge that happened at COP26 3 years ago, and it's pretty important to cut methane. The less of it. The reason why it's important to target methane is that methane is sort of 25, though there's far less of it in the atmosphere than particularly than carbon dioxide. Because it's less, it's 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide in terms of trapping warming. That is to say that molecule for molecule, methane is 25% in terms of causing more warming than carbon dioxide, though it has a much shorter lifespan of about 12 to 13 years. But the biggest source of methane actually is not so much landfills. I mean, actually, it's the production and transport of fossil fuels, particularly of natural gas, but also coal and oil, and that includes sort of the leakage from pipelines. And in fact, the U.S. is one of the biggest culprits in this respect because of the massive expansion of shale gas that's happened there in recent years. So broadly, I would say that this declaration actually is welcome, but we also need to be targeting other and bigger sources of methane, and particularly the fossil fuel industry.
Right. I mean, one of the few positives of COP29, that's good to hear. Now, coming to one last question on this COP29 specifically, how do you assess India's role this year? I mean, especially, we take very righteous positions in these global forums, but internally, domestically, I don't think we are, in terms of our policy, we are particularly climate conscious, especially when it comes to environment. You gave the example of Andaman and Nicobar. But it's like really atrocious, what the plans of developing it into I don't know what all economic zone and resort and so on. So where does our climate commitment posturing internationally, how does it translate domestically? Do you see that kind of urgency in our own internal decision making? Like, what are your thoughts there?
No, I don't actually see that kind of urgency. I mean, at this particular COP, India took certain positions. They demanded a higher goal of 1.3 trillion. They stood along with China. They had a stand against the European Union's CBAM, etc. But they also opposed things like a just transition and said that developing countries should take the lead. They opposed things around the global stock take. Broadly, climate action domestically that you're referring to, you're asking about, it's very interesting. It's sort of a very fascinating transmission. On the one hand, we've got a right-wing government, but one that's not hostile to climate change. It's not like Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc. On the other hand, it's not. Neither are we driven by climate change in terms of our energy policy. What we are actually driven by, our bigger drivers are energy security and a desire to save our import bill. Now, by itself, these are non-trivial concerns. These are valid concerns, but it's not climate change. And that's actually reflected in our energy position and energy transition. So if you actually look at electricity data, and I'm now quoting from the Central Electricity Authority, in the last few years, it's basically only coal and solar power that's been expanding in terms of capacity. And even with solar, as of last year, there were only sort of 9 of 57 solar parks planned that had been completed. And as a consequence, if you take the actual production as opposed to capacity, which is actually what one should do with renewables. Last year, renewables, solar and wind, new renewables was just 13% of India's electricity actual generation, and it's about 25% if you include large hydro. It suggests that the trajectory has actually been quite slow. There's hardly been any expansion of wind power, and that's partly because of a change policy in 2017. It's not showing. I don't. It's not displaying the kind of urgency in policy matters. And I think honestly, I mean, just to go a slight aside, I think the political elites would be forced to show more urgency if the people showed more urgency as well. And essentially, if they were pushed from below. I don't see that happening either in India. And that's a sort of longer conversation about climate movements that I think we can take up later. Now, what would this urgency actually imply? I think it would imply a far greater expansion of renewables, and in particular wind, which, as I said, has been pretty much stagnant and sort of slowly rising. I would also say that we would avoid measures that are not particularly helpful, in particular kind of slow down or thrust towards nuclear and small modular reactors that the government's been talking about, because these are essentially costly, very, very time consuming and hazardous. I mean, if you look at Ramana's work on this, it's sort of MB Ramana's, I mean, it's very, very, very clear that these are things that one should actually avoid. And what you do instead is to sort of put that money in things like public transport, solar manufacturing. We are so reliable even on solar on basically imports from China. So we need to be expanding our manufacturing capacity with solar panels and so on. That's one thing we could do. A second we could do, I think, is to also, I think, inform people more about climate change. There's a fair dearth of popular information about climate change itself still, despite all these years. There's also institutional matters, sort of not work in silos, as is the case that's been happening now for years. And fourth, I think, and really importantly, looking ahead, I think we need to sort of plan for a just transition. Not say like we did in Baku, where the COP29 say that developed countries should show the lead, and we need to be supported in it. Because in India, and when I'm talking about just transition, what am I referring to? I'm referring to, in particular, cushioning the workers who are currently working in the fossil fuel industry. Again, what happens to them when a transition kind of unfolds? So we're talking of millions of workers, in coal mining, in coal plants, and entire township, because entire development trajectory in central India, in parts of Jharkhand, Orissa, eastern Maharashtra, etc. These entire townships that are essentially grown around coal. So what happens to those townships as we transition away from coal and move towards expanding renewables? I think that's something. This is something that is very insufficient planning so far. To the best of my knowledge, only one state, that is Jharkhand, has begun some initial moves on the matter by setting up a committee to research a just transition, but that's much more is needed. And a conversation has kind of just begun among trade unions about what a just transition might imply, both in the coal sector and also in the transport sector, where actually, as we shift from the industrial internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, what does it imply for those hundreds, in fact, thousands of MSMEs that are supplying these small parts for the auto industry? So that kind of conversation, I think, should deepen and be made wider, both among trade unions and in civil society.
Right. I think a just transition internally, it also, apart from the global platforms, that's an important factor. And secondly, as you said, the push for climate urgency has to come from below, and hopefully we will see more of that in government action. Now, another interesting question which has come up, especially this month, Nagaraj, is the re-election of Donald Trump. And we know he's been a climate denier, but so far he has not made any such noises after being elected. So is there any likelihood of the Trump effect on the US's postures and stances, with regard to the entire climate negotiations? Is there any danger of the US withdrawing from the Paris Accord, as was, there was a danger in his previous term?
Yes, I mean, Trump winning also already had a bearing on Baku. And from what I hear, for instance, the kind of amounts that the US delegation was willing to commit was reportedly, possibly less than it might have been because of Trump sort of coming to power from next year. I also read that, Saudi Arabia was quite emboldened in its positions because of Trump victory. As far as, climate finance goes, the U.S. Department of State, and I'm quoting from the official website, it says that the U.S. contributed $11 billion this year, including sort of loans and grants. And it's quite likely that this figure of 11 billion might either dip or be less than if there was somebody else. I certainly don't see it sort of rising much beyond 11 billion going forward when sort of Trump is power to meet this modest target of 300 billion that's been sort of talked about. As far as them leaving the Paris agreement, well, that's very likely. He had done that the last time. He has already said in his campaign that he'll do it pretty quickly after 20th of January. Question is, will he leave the UNFCCC, the convention under which the Paris Agreement operates? That is an open question. It's also possible, and that also becomes more hazardous and problematic, because if the United States leaves the UNFCCC, then it needs Senate approval to kind of re-enter, and that may not be easy, particularly given the Senate also is controlled by the Republicans now. Trump getting in power also has sort of broader effects, in terms of what effects it might have on U.S. domestic energy use and emissions, because that's eventually, what affects sort of climate change and global warming. I think one needs to disaggregate the different fuels. I mean, actually, under the Trump administration earlier, when he was in power, actually coal consumption actually declined in those 4 years by about 100 million tons, while oil and gas consumption rose very sharply. And this actually has to do with the U.S. energy trajectory. It has to do with the discovery of shale oil and shale gas, which starts around 2011, 2012, whereby U.S. oil production rather, has sort of risen from just barely 7 million barrels a day about 10 or 12, 15 years ago to actually over 19 million barrels, the largest in the world last year, and over 1,000 billion cubic meters of gas, which is just, again, huge, and it's more than they consume. That's going to kind of continue, both oil and gas. And also, there's been questions about whether he might dismantle the climate acts that the Biden government administration had introduced, in particular the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the Trump cannot entirely dismantle the IRA, but he can certainly tweak the rules and make it more difficult for an expansion of solar power or wind power in the US. And that might kind of slow down the expansion of renewable power in the US, which would adversely affect both US climate targets that they have pledged, and also would also imply that it might, as sort of US production, because he has also said that he's going to open out, places that are considered off limits earlier. In particular, worrying thing is the Arctic, the areas in the Arctic where there's a lot of oil and gas. What it implies that even if US consumption flattens out, fossil fuel consumption, production might still increase, and you might still have the exports of fossil fuel or petroleum products to other countries. I mean, last year the US exported petroleum products to 123 countries. So you're talking of very, very large exports which might continue, which implies emissions happening, only they'll happen elsewhere. And in particular, the exports of LNG, which happened a lot to Europe after the Ukraine war and after the decline in gas imports from Russia following the Ukraine war. Europe was forced to sort of increase its imports of LNG from the US.
Right. So, Nagaraj, we're running out of time. So, two quick questions before we wrap up. Half of all carbon dioxide emissions, since the Industrial Revolution have occurred in the last 30 to 35 years, which is also the period of the COP process. So, one, has the COP process really been effective at all, or has it been as effective as it should have been? And secondly, looking ahead, also keeping in mind the very, very modest pledges of recent COPs, especially this year's COP Conference of Parties, what do these kinds of pledges imply for the energy transitions that have begun in various countries, including India? Where do we stand looking ahead? Can you just quickly wrap up these two, questions which are on the minds of, I think, most people who are following the climate negotiations and the climate debates all over the world?
In the period in which the COPs were happening, in the last almost 30 years, carbon emissions have kind of risen by over 60%, which is sort of, and emissions are the most important. Emissions and mitigation of all the areas are the most important arena of climate change. Now, there's basically two drivers for carbon emissions. One is that the fossil fuels tend to be very carbon dense. And secondly, a second driver is sort of which are economic essentially, which is maximizing growth and maximizing profits. Now, the COP process has been trying with limited success to address the first by trying to catalyze a shift away from fossil fuels towards renewables, in which they've been successful to a very limited degree. It's also been helped by a very sharp fall in the price of renewables of solar and wind, and particularly because of greater manufacturing in China. As far as the second process goes regarding economic growth, it's something that they will not and cannot address. In fact, forget these sort of capitalist, industrialized countries. Even in China, the provinces in China are currently trying to maximize growth as the Chinese economy kind of closed down. So it's actually these sort of structural factors, which over the last 30 years, which includes a movement of capital, particularly to China, where China became essentially the factory of the world, where urbanization kind of happened. Particularly, there was this sort of 2 or 3 year period where there were sort of more emissions from urbanization in China than the entire US emissions in the 20th century from urbanization. So it took a very vast structural factors. Even the IPCC talks about it. Even the latest IPCC report talks about the fact that sort of the economic growth, the rising emissions from economic growth has kind of limited the gains made from energy efficiency or from a shift to renewables. So these are sort of structural factors, some of which the COP can kind of address, and some of it would actually be sort of maybe more difficult for the corporates. Now, looking forward, I think as we move forward as a transition, now the transition tends to be a very slow process. The previous transition from wood to coal kind of took 50 or 60 years in the mid 19th century. Now, our idea is to sort of make it faster. Going forward, data from the latest statistical review of world energy suggests that we are nowhere near the pace and extent that's needed. And because despite the pretty impressive growth in renewables, in particular solar, it's only helping at the margins.
No, is there a case to be made for moving beyond COP29? Because we have seen how effective it is, how modest the outcomes have been. Some people are talking about climate clubs. You try other forums. You don't need to get 170 countries on one place to do anything. You can start by looking at smaller forums of maybe 15 countries, which are come together to sort of exert their collective weight on some local issue. Is that the way to go, maybe in addition to this COP process?
That's right. So, two things. One is that certain kinds of forums already exist. For instance, there already are collective bodies of cities which are sort of get together periodically and trying to address the problem. Certain regional entities within countries have said that they're going to move at a particular pace. In particular, for instance, California and the US is saying that irrespective of whether Trump comes to power or what happens, we're going to carry on with our spread of renewables or shift to EVs, etc. So there's those kind of entities that are trying to sort of address the problem within India as well. I mean, based in Delhi. As far as the other interesting point you make about clubs of countries getting together, I think that's something that has potential. But how does it kind of ally? Interesting question would be is how does it ally with great power politics going forward? I think there's a need for the sort of global south, countries of the global south, and in this I would sort of include I would play the global south at sort of three levels. There's China, there's countries like India and Brazil, which are large developing countries, and then there are LDCs. These countries kind of getting together and pushing for a more progressive, a faster kind of transition, and putting pressure on the US in particular, and pushing pressure on the sort of developed countries to free up resources to carry out a faster transition, which they need to do. But more broadly, I'm saying there are also these structural factors that these countries need to address, both within these large developing countries, within India, within China, because you need to then sort of address ways of how essentially you can also reduce demand, but also do it in a way that's equitable. So, what are the kind of measures that could then reduce demand and do it in a way that's equitable, kind of going forward? And that requires a much larger transformation of public transport systems, of a different kind of urbanization, of a renewable expansion that may be more decentralized but also much larger, that also enables access for local people. For instance, if you were to have solar parks, which takes away land, it takes away water, you need to ensure that local people firstly have access to that electricity. They get a certain share of it. They do it in ways that minimizes the impact. So a lot is possible at different levels. But certainly institutionally, I think what you're saying is very interesting. For these kind of groups of countries coming forward to pressurize the historical elite, the historically developed countries. for a faster transition and a faster, more just transition. But I think it needs pressure from below. It's not going to happen without the climate movements getting stronger. And I think one factor, I wouldn't say it's a reason, but one factor for these really modest sort of developments in COPs like Baku, or the entire COP process, is that actually the climate movement is so far is growing. It's certainly grown in the last 4 or 5 years. And it certainly was a big factor in America, in Europe, and so on. But it's still not strong enough to push for a faster transition, and in particular to push for a more just transition that is just both for workers in the fossil fuel industries and also for ordinary people who are dependent. I mean, electricity and energy ought to be a
Right. I think, Nagaraj, this what you're saying about this push from below and the fact that last 4 5 years, the climate movement has grown. I think, from my own observation, what I find is that it's no credit to any particular climate mobilizing group or club. I think it's more the climate itself has been creating that urgency. We got like more and more of these extreme weather events, flooding and forest fires in all kinds of places. The Spain, an entire city flooded, and people have never had these kinds of experiences before. I think the radicalization, quote unquote, of climate consciousness, I think is being driven by the changes in climate itself. And I think that is where I think there is hope, which is, even though it's not really a hope, it's a bad thing for anybody to have to experience. But I think the structural issues which you pointed to do with capitalism and the structures of how the entire globe is structured into the center and the periphery, they have got their respective roles in this capitalist structure. I think the only way that could even come to the table for discussion is through these extreme climate events, raising the consciousness of people below, and then the pressure from below sort of having some kind of impact on the elite who are sitting and sort of making all these pledges. On whose behalf are these pledges? So I think it'll be interesting to see how these things unfold in the coming years, and the various other platforms, the plastic COP, so to speak, which is also coming up. So we'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much once again. Sorry to cut you short. We're sort of gone way past the time slot. Thank you so much once again, Nagaraj. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me, Sampath.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.